Unlike Windows computers, Linux is not vulnerable to malware. So, how often have you heard this sentence? I am willing to bet plenty. I thought of it myself. So, one of the most widespread myths about Linux is that Linux users are inherently more secure than Windows users because Linux can't catch malware. And this is obviously a falsehood, as anyone with even some basic computer science understanding can guess. There is no reason why a Linux computer would not be able to run malicious code. Digging deeper into this myth, though, it is easier to see where people who claim this fact come from. Since Windows holds the majority of the desktop market share, most cyber attacks in the form of malicious ads or phishing emails are going to target Windows computers. However, this overly basic understanding of cybersecurity and malware is far disconnected from reality. Even if clicking on a malicious attachment was the only way one could get infected, malicious code can run on more platforms than one might think of. Like if Doom can run in a PDF file on the Chromium PDF editor on any operating systems, why would your Linux system be inherently any safer? But we are not here to discuss that. But in 2025, most people know better than to download and open questionable file types from random emails. Like the good cyber attacks are actually a lot more complex than that. In the past, there have been several cases where an attack managed to hijack a small independently maintained website that a developer used to distribute binaries for the program and leverage that to distribute an infected payload to users. There are ways to counter this, as an example by checking the hash of the file that you downloaded, but does it mean much if the original hash that you're comparing it against is from the same web page that has been modified? You might be tempted to write this off as something that only affects Windows or Mac users. After all, in Linux land, the standard way to install a piece of software is to use your distro's package manager to obtain the package from a centralized, trustworthy source. This already improves the security of installing a piece of software remarkably better. Your distro infrastructure is properly safeguarded, I hope, and it is likely more secure than the homebrew home server some random independent developer is hosting. But is it perfect? Now, imagine if an attacker was able to carry out a sophisticated enough attack that they were able to get an infected version of a certain package, perhaps something critical like a library that a lot of other applications you may have installed or depend on, or the Linux kernel itself, directly into your distro repositories. And imagine if nobody ever finds out. And you don't have to imagine. This is called a supply chain attack, and it is one of the attacks that you, the end user, cannot do a lot to avoid. This is what happened to the compression library XZ. I am going to be short here because this would deserve an entire dedicated article to itself, and I did one, but the entire XZ project was compromised by a malicious maintainer going under the name of Jiatan. They spent several years building a reputation as a core contributor to the project, only to then abuse that trust to build a backdoor within the project in one of the Tarball source code releases. Linux distros typically build their packages from those releases, and eventually the malicious code had found its ways into a gigantic number of Linux systems. Thankfully, the malicious payload was discovered early enough that only users who had very recently upgraded the system were affected, but it could have been a disaster. And this is bad. Like, forget about obviously suspicious email attachments from shady senders. This kind of attack does not spare anybody. While there is not much that can be done at the distro level to prevent future situations like this, Linux distributions can still take steps to ensure that their own packages they build and distribute through their infrastructures are exactly as you would expect them to be. What if there was a way to ensure that the binaries that were produced from a compilation and package build of a piece of software matched perfectly the source code and there is nothing that slipped through the cracks? And good news, this is called a reproducible build. So, quoting the official definition from the Reproducible Build initiative directly, reproducible builds are a set of software development practices that create an independently verifiable path from source to binary code. A build environment produces reproducible builds when it is deterministic. With the same inputs, the same outputs are built. If building the same source code on the same operating system using the same compiler and build instructions, anybody is able to reproduce a bit-by-bit identical copy of an artifact, then it means that the builds are reproducible. So if you were to be able to prove that a finished package build you get is perfectly equivalent to what you were expecting to get, it would be trivially easy to avoid a host of issues. An attacker would have no business in trying to ship malware by compromising your package repos. A hardware defect, such as a bit flip in the memory of a compile server, would not cause a broken package build that would break in subtle ways on people's computers. All in all, users would be running systems that are more secure and more reliable, eliminating an entire class of possible bugs and attacks. An unsung benefit of this situation is that this really aids the debuggability of artifacts. If the build output is provable to be a one-to-one derivative from the source code, then it is also easier to debug unexpected behavior. It can be taken for granted that malfunction is indeed due to a bug in the source code, rather than to a side effect caused by some bit flip that happened in non-ECC memory at compile time. While the topic of reproducible builds in Linux distribution is a hot one, this is not a new practice. The GNU project has been involved with reproducible builds since 1990, when they were making active efforts to make the builds from their GNU core utils bit for bit reproducible. Not much later, people started talking about integrating reproducible builds in the Debian project. The topic was mentioned at first in 2000 and then more explicitly in 2007 when Martin Waker, is that how you pronounce it, mentioned the possibility of implementing reproducible builds in the Debian devel mailing list. And I quote, "I think it would be really cool if the Debian policy required that packages could be rebuilt bit identical from source." Martin Waker, 2007. Before that, though, let me tell you about the sponsor of this video, which is no one. Or rather, it's you. In order to do all of this, I have to pay not only hosting costs and fees and taxes, but I also pay for another script writer, Luca, who wrote this video because he's much better than me in these kind of things, and also equipment that you see around me. Sadly, this currently puts me at a loss of like $500 a month. So in order to continue making these videos, I need to break even. There's almost 100 people already supporting me amongst various platforms, Patreon, PayPal, LibrePay, Ko-Fi, and more. And I'm extremely grateful to all of them, as that's the only reason I'm able to do all of this. Links are in the video description if you want to join, and you can also subscribe on the website thelibre.news. On the same website, by the way, you can read this video as a text article if you prefer reading over listening to my terrible pronunciation. You can also subscribe to them to receive them as newsletter if you prefer, and there's some extra content for subscribers, like 2 interviews and 1 team meeting. So please help us break even and continue doing videos if you can. Back to the video. After that email, interest in reproducible builds grew slowly through the years, first due to the Bitcoin project implementing them, and then due to the disclosure on global surveillance in 2013. In light of those findings, Mike Perry began working to make Tor browser builds reproducible in order to stop a third party from attacking the infrastructure directly to compromise the browser. I quote, "Malware that attacks the software development and build processes themselves to distribute copies of itself to tens or even hundreds of millions of machines in a single officially signed instantaneous update." Mike Perry of the Tor project, 2013. The Debian project finally started working on reproducible builds for their own infrastructure in 2013 as well, after considering the idea at a discussion held in July at DebConf 13. The discussion had been organized last minute, and it had only like 30 attendees, including the technical committee and other core teams. The change was introduced via a discussion, again held in DevConf 13, where other projects that had been implementing that technology, such as the Bitcoin currency, were brought as a demonstration of the possibility and advantages of implementing such a system. The Debian community was so interested in what had been the output of that discussion that a wiki page about reproducible builds was created, with the idea to get 5 packages to build reproducibly as a proof of concept. Getting that proof of concept really unveiled several critical areas in the toolchain that would have needed to be addressed to make even one single package to build reproducibly. And this is where the bulk of the work began. That work proceeded very quickly too. After some infrastructural modification and 2 mass rebuilds, 67% of packages already supported reproducible builds by August 2014, in time for DebConf 14. The fruits of Debian's labor were fruitful. Well, in July 2017, 90% of the packages distributed by the Debian project were reproducible, and today all of them should support reproducible builds. While Debian is a virtuous example in adoption of this technology, Fedora is not quite there yet. For the longest time, the need for implementing reproducible builds was not evident in the project. All RPMs are built in a centralized, strongly protected environment, and all packages are built from dist-git, a Git repository that contains the build instructions and the cryptographic hash of the package sources. This system allows to easily verify what changed between package builds, with what inputs were built and what changed in the build environment. Because of this very strong and very vertical control of the entire build process, for the longest time, reproducible builds have not been considered a priority in the Fedora project. There are also some caveats to implementing reproducible builds in the same way Debian has in Fedora. Because RPM packages are distributed after signing with a signature embedded in the RPM itself, it is impossible to achieve fully identical results. Another obstacle is that RPM builds inject some information about build time into the headers, which is mutable by definition. However, there is ongoing discussion about these issues. That should not mean that Fedora project is not taking steps to make their builds at least way more reproducible than they currently are. The work has kicked off after a discussion at the RPM developers meetup at the devconf.cz 2023, a recurring event where RPM developers catch up on the status of RPM packaging. From there, a Hackfest was organized during Flock 2023, that year's edition of Fedora's project conference, where the work was given more structure. Goals were formulated, an approach was defined, and documentation work on the known issues started. A recap of the Hackfest is available on Discourse for those of you that might be interested. And at last, the project gets announced on the Devel list in March 2024, kicking off the real work on reproducible builds for good. Now, it remains to be seen what progress will be made in the following months. Flock 2025 will be held in early June this year, and sadly, odds are I will not be able to be physically there, but it's an event worth staying tuned for. Hopefully, we will know more by then. There is an interesting talk on a better dist-git CI in the schedule already, amongst several other that seems related, so I have little doubt that we will know more about this topic soon. Oof. What if I started reading poetry instead, in Italian? It's so much easier than English stuff about technical packages. Reproducible. To reproduce. Reproducible. I guess. Would it be funny if I incorrectly pronounced reproducible for like the whole video?